Richard Lawson was 63 years old when he walked into his own house and saw something that would divide his life into before and after. People keep asking what he said when he stepped into that living room and saw her. They want to know if he shouted, if he lost control, if he became the kind of man who breaks things when everything falls apart. The truth is, he didn't raise his voice at all. He barely said a word. But by sunrise the next morning, what he chose to do to his own son, most people would call it cold. What they don't understand is that men like Richard don't react the way others expect, not after the kind of life he had lived, not after growing up in a house where he was always second, always overlooked, always the one people laughed at while someone else got everything. He had already walked away from one family once and learned how to survive without anyone. That kind of lesson doesn't leave you. So when he stepped inside that afternoon, when he saw what had been happening under his own roof while he was gone, something in him didn't explode. It settled. And when a man like Richard Lawson goes quiet like that, when everything inside him turns still instead of loud, that's when the real damage begins. Get comfortable and remember, the people in these stories always had a choice. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment, hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to want to hear how this ends. That afternoon was never supposed to happen like that. Richard Lawson had wrapped up his final meeting earlier than expected. The kind of rare break in schedule that most people would use to sit somewhere quiet and let the day slow down. But he wasn't most people, and the idea of heading straight home without a call or a warning settled into his mind almost immediately. Not as a decision he debated, but as something that simply made sense. He had built a life on showing up when it mattered, and there was a quiet satisfaction in the thought of walking through his own front door ahead of time, catching the ordinary rhythm of his home exactly as it was, unfiltered and unprepared. The drive back felt shorter than usual, the familiar roads cutting through the Arizona heat in long stretches of sun and pavement, and by the time he turned into his street, he was already thinking about small things. A late lunch, a moment of quiet, maybe a conversation that didn't have anything to do with contracts or deadlines. Then he saw the car. It was parked halfway up his driveway, angled just enough to suggest it hadn't been there long, and he recognized it instantly, not because he had seen it often, but because it carried the kind of presence that made an impression the first time and never quite left after that. The engine in his own car idled for a second longer than necessary before he shut it off, his hand resting on the steering wheel as something familiar pressed at the edge of his awareness. The same low instinct that had followed him since he was young, back when reading a room correctly meant the difference between being ignored and being pushed aside completely. He stepped out, closed the door without slamming it, and walked toward the house with a pace that didn't change, didn't hurry, didn't slow, just steady enough to hide the fact that his attention had sharpened. The front door wasn't locked. That alone wasn't unusual, but it wasn't comforting either. He pushed it open and paused just inside, not because he needed to, but because the sound reached him before anything else did. From somewhere deeper in the house, laughter carried through, loose and easy, the kind of sound people make when they feel entirely at ease, when nothing around them requires caution or restraint. It rolled out in waves, overlapping voices, the clink of dishes, a chair shifting across the floor, all of it forming a picture without him needing to see it yet. And then there was everything else. The absence of movement where there should have been some, the stillness in the air near the entrance, the kind of quiet that doesn't belong in a home that's clearly occupied. Richard set his keys down without looking at where they landed and took a step further inside, his gaze moving through the room in a slow, deliberate sweep, not searching for anything specific yet, but registering every detail the way a man does when he has learned, over years of being underestimated, that what you notice first is often what matters most. The moment he stepped further inside, everything shifted. Richard's eyes moved past the entryway and into the living room, and that was where he saw her, not sitting, not resting, but down on the floor in a position that made no sense at first glance, her body angled against the base of the couch as if she had tried to hold herself up and failed somewhere in the attempt. Denise Lawson had one hand pressed against her face, her breathing uneven, her shoulders rising and falling in a rhythm that was wrong in a way that didn't need explanation, and when her eyes found him, there was something in that look that erased every other sound in the house. It wasn't panic, not exactly. And it wasn't confusion either. It was recognition, immediate and complete, like she had been holding on to something fragile, and the moment she saw him, she didn't have to hold it alone anymore. Richard crossed the distance without hesitation, dropping to one knee beside her, his hand steady as it reached for her shoulder, grounding her, keeping her upright while his other hand moved to his phone, dialing emergency services with a precision that came from years of handling problems without waiting for someone else to step in. His voice stayed level as he spoke, giving clear answers, following instructions, adjusting his position slightly when told, every movement controlled, efficient, deliberate. Denise tried to say something, but the words didn't come out fully, and he didn't ask her to repeat them. He just stayed there, close enough for her to focus on, one hand supporting her, the other keeping the phone in place, as the operator guided him through the next steps. And through all of it, through the urgency and the focus, and the narrowing of his attention to the woman in front of him, the sound from the other side of the house didn't stop. Lauder still carried from the kitchen, lower now, but present, threaded with conversation that rose and fell in casual patterns. The scrape of a chair, the clink of glass, the unmistakable ease of people who had settled into something comfortable. Richard didn't turn his head toward it, not yet, but he heard it clearly, each detail registering without breaking the rhythm of what he was doing. The dispatcher's voice continued in his ear, calm and structured, asking for updates, confirming details, and he responded the same way, his tone unchanged, his focus locked where it needed to be. Denise's grip tightened briefly against his arm, a small movement, but enough for him to adjust his position again, steadying her, keeping her from slipping further down. The seconds stretched, not in panic, but in weight, each one carrying more awareness than the last. And when the distant sound of approaching sirens finally reached the edge of the moment, it didn't bring relief as much as confirmation that what he was seeing was as serious as it felt. The front door opened behind him not long after, footsteps moving quickly inside, voices shifting the space as trained hands took over, assessing, positioning, working with a speed that came from experience. Richard stayed where he was until he was told to step back, and even then he didn't move far. His attention fixed on the process unfolding in front of him, while everything else in the house, every other presence, every other sound, settled into a different kind of awareness entirely. When the paramedics took over, Richard finally stood up. He adjusted his jacket with a slow, deliberate motion, his expression settled into something unreadable, and then he turned toward the sound that had been sitting in the background the entire time, not forgotten, not ignored, just waiting. The kitchen was only a few steps away, but the distance carried a weight to it, each step measured, controlled, as if he had already decided that whatever waited on the other side of that doorway would not be met with reaction, only with action. When he reached the entrance, he didn't rush in. He paused just long enough to take in the scene without announcing himself, his eyes moving across the table, the plates, the half-finished drinks, the casual arrangement of people who looked like they had been enjoying an ordinary afternoon without interruption. Tyler Lawson sat at the center, shoulders squared, posture alert. The second he noticed the presence in the doorway, while across from him sat Howard Briggs, his hands resting comfortably on the table as though he were hosting rather than visiting. And beside him, Eileen Briggs, her posture more restrained but no less settled into the moment they had created. For a brief second, no one spoke, the room holding that thin edge of silence that comes when something shifts, and everyone feels it at the same time. Tyler stood first, the movement quick, almost automatic, a reaction that didn't need to be explained, and he opened his mouth to say something. But Richard raised one hand slightly, not high, not aggressive, just enough to stop the words before they formed. The gesture worked immediately, cutting through whatever explanation had been building, leaving the space clear for something else. Richard stepped forward then, not fast, not slow, just steady, and came to a stop at the edge of the table, his gaze moving past his son and settling on Howard. When he spoke, his voice was even, controlled in a way that carried more weight than anger ever could. He told them to leave. There was no emphasis, no raised tone, just a clear instruction delivered without hesitation. Howard shifted in his chair, the confidence still there, but now edged with something else, something that tried to present itself as calm authority, and he leaned forward slightly as if preparing to turn the moment into a conversation he could manage. He began to respond, choosing his words carefully. But Richard didn't give him the space to finish, cutting across him with the same level tone. repeating the instruction without adding anything more. Eileen's attention flicked between the two men, her composure tightening as she reached for her bag, her body already preparing to disengage from a situation that was no longer comfortable. Tyler remained standing, caught between positions he could no longer hold at the same time, his eyes shifting from one face to another, searching for an opening that didn't exist anymore. Howard exhaled slowly, pushing back his chair with a controlled movement, the kind meant to suggest choice rather than compliance. And he stood, adjusting his sleeves as if the moment required formality. Without another word, he moved toward the exit, Eileen following closely, her steps quicker now, her attention no longer on maintaining appearances but on leaving. As they passed through the living room, the activity there drew their eyes without invitation. The presence of professionals, the equipment, the urgency that had replaced the stillness, and for the first time since Richard had entered the house, something in their expressions shifted in a way that couldn't be managed or redirected. The front door closed behind them with a quiet finality that settled through the space. Richard remained where he was. For a moment, the kitchen now reduced to just two people, the distance between them no longer physical but defined by something far more permanent. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down, placing his hands on the table in front of him, his gaze steady as it returned to Tyler. He told him to sit. What Tyler said next didn't sound like a mistake, it sounded planned. He sat down slowly when told, the movement controlled but not confident, his hands coming together on the table in front of him as if he needed something to hold on to while he figured out how much to say and how to say it. Richard didn't rush him, didn't interrupt, didn't fill the silence. He simply waited, his gaze steady in a way that made it clear this was not a conversation that would drift or soften on its own. Tyler exhaled once, ran a hand over his face, then began, not with an apology, not with denial, but with explanation. The kind that tries to organize events into something that sounds reasonable when spoken out loud. He said the visit had been arranged ahead of time, not spontaneous, not casual, that there had been discussions before that afternoon, calls, meetings, ideas about the company, about expansion, about how things could be structured differently if the right decisions were made. He mentioned documents, actual paperwork, brought into the house with the intention of being signed, papers that would shift operational control of certain contracts into his hands under the justification that it would streamline decisions and position the business for growth. Richard listened without reacting, his expression unchanged, but inside that dullness, everything was being measured against something far older than the moment sitting in front of him. Tyler continued, explaining that the proposal had been presented as temporary, as a step toward transition, something that would eventually benefit everyone involved, especially him, especially his future, the kind of argument that sounds convincing when built on ambition and trust at the same time. Then he hesitated, just slightly, and that pause carried more weight than anything he had said before. He admitted that Denise had come into the kitchen while they were talking, that she had heard enough to understand what was being asked, and that she had not agreed. According to him, she had been direct, firm in a way that left no room for negotiation, stating clearly that the company was not his to restructure, that no one had the authority to move anything forward without Richard's consent, and that bringing those documents into the house under those circumstances crossed a line that shouldn't have been approached in the first place. Tyler's voice shifted when he described what followed, the tone tightening as he tried to frame the escalation, saying that the conversation became tense, that voices were raised, that the discussion turned from proposal to argument in a matter of minutes. He said Denise had pressed harder, refusing to let the subject drop, and that the pressure in the room had built quickly, the kind that doesn't ease once it starts climbing. At some point, he said, she stopped mid-sentence, her expression changing, her hand moving to her temple as she tried to steady herself, mentioning that she felt unwell before stepping away from the table. He claimed he thought she just needed a moment, that she would sit down and recover, that it wasn't unusual for stress to affect her that way, and that the conversation in the kitchen had continued after she left because it hadn't been resolved yet. Richard's eyes didn't leave him as he spoke, and when Tyler reached the end of that explanation, when the words finally ran out and there was nothing left to organize or justify, the silence that followed settled in with a clarity that didn't need to be broken immediately. There were no questions asked right away, no raised voice demanding more detail. just the weight of what had been said sitting between them, stripped of tone, stripped of intent, reduced to the simple fact that when it mattered, when a decision needed to be made between stepping away and continuing, Tyler had chosen to stay at that table. That night, Richard didn't raise his voice. He made decisions. The house settled into a quiet that felt heavier than silence. The kind that doesn't come from peace, but from something unresolved pressing against the walls. And he moved through it without hesitation, not wandering, not pacing, just going exactly where he needed to go, as if every step had already been mapped out, long before this day ever arrived. Denise was resting under careful watch in the bedroom, stable for the moment, and he stayed with her long enough to make sure her breathing had steadied, his hand resting lightly over hers, until the tension in her grip eased. Then he stood and left the room without a word, closing the door behind him with the same controlled motion he had carried through the entire evening. The study was where he went next, the one place in the house that had always belonged entirely to him. And when he sat down at the desk, he didn't pause to think about what to do, because that part was already finished. What remained was execution. He opened his laptop, pulled up accounts, documents, access points, everything that connected his son to the life he had built over decades, and he began removing them one by one with a level of precision that came from years of understanding exactly how systems worked and how quickly they could be changed when the person in control decided it was time. Authorized access to company accounts was revoked first, not delayed, not reviewed, simply removed. The permissions stripped clean in a matter of minutes, followed by financial links that existed quietly for years without question, monthly transfers, shared cards, small conveniences that had never been discussed because they had always been there. Each one disappeared with the same finality, not paused, not adjusted, but ended. He made calls next, not many, just the ones that mattered, people who had known him long enough to understand the weight behind a short conversation, and he told them clearly that any association tied to his son through him was no longer valid, that no introductions, no endorsements, no open doors should be extended under his name moving forward. There were no explanations offered, and none were requested, because trust built over time doesn't require justification when it shifts. After that, he moved to the legal side of things, reviewing contracts connected to the business, tightening structures, reinforcing ownership lines so that no one, not now, not later, could position themselves near anything he had created without his direct involvement. The process was methodical, step after step, each action reinforcing the next, until there was nothing left in reach that hadn't been addressed. At some point in the early hours, he leaned back slightly in his chair, not from exhaustion but from completion, and for a brief moment, something older surfaced in the stillness around him. He remembered a different house, years ago, where his name carried no weight, where decisions were made without him, where being overlooked was expected and speaking up changed nothing. He had walked away from that place with nothing, built everything from the ground up, and learned that the only way to keep what mattered was to recognize the moment it was being threatened and act before it was taken. That lesson had never left him. It had just been waiting for the right moment to matter again. By the time the sky outside began to lighten, there was nothing left undone, no loose ends, no half measures, just a clear line drawn through everything that had connected his son to the structure he controlled. By the time morning came, everything had already changed. The house carried a different kind of stillness, not heavy like the night before, but settled, defined, as if something invisible had been removed, and the structure left behind was now exactly what it was supposed to be. Richard was already awake, moving through his routine without hesitation, his actions precise, unaffected, the kind of calm that doesn't come from rest but from certainty. Denise was sitting up when he entered the room, her strength not fully returned but steady enough to meet his eyes without strain. And he took a seat beside her, speaking quietly, not explaining everything in detail, just enough for her to understand that what needed to be handled had been handled. She watched him for a moment longer than usual, searching for something in his expression, then gave a small nod, not questioning, not pushing, simply accepting the version of him that had made those decisions. Outside, the first sign of interruption came shortly after, a figure approaching the front door with a pace that carried urgency without direction. Tyler stood there for several seconds after realizing the key no longer worked, the small, repeated motion of trying again telling him more than any explanation could have. When the door didn't open, he stepped back, looking at the house as if expecting it to respond differently the longer he stared, then knocked, once, then again, the sound echoing through the quiet interior without being answered. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then lowered it, the weight of the situation settling in not through words, but through the absence of everything he had always assumed would be there. Across the street, a second presence appeared, slower, more measured, and when Caroline Lawson stepped onto the edge of the driveway, her attention moved between the house and her brother with a clarity that didn't need to be explained. She had not been inside the night before, but she had seen enough over time to understand what kind of moment this was, and she didn't approach him with questions, only with recognition. Tyler spoke first, trying to frame something that could be fixed, something that could be explained, but the words didn't hold, and Caroline didn't interrupt him. She just listened until he ran out of them, then shook her head once, not in anger, not in disappointment, but in acknowledgement of a line that had already been crossed. Inside, Richard stood at the window, watching without moving closer, not hiding, not revealing himself either, just observing the outcome of decisions that had already been made. He didn't step outside, didn't open the door, didn't offer a second conversation, because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to clarify. The distance between them was no longer something that could be reduced by explanation or intention. It had been set by action, and that kind of distance doesn't close once it's defined. Tyler remained where he was for a while longer, the realization settling in piece by piece, not through confrontation, but through removal, through the absence of access, of support, of the structure he had relied on without understanding what it required to maintain. Carolyn turned away first, not waiting for him to follow, not asking him to, choosing instead to step back from something she knew couldn't be repaired by standing there. Richard watched until the space in front of the house was empty again, then stepped away from the window and returned to the room where Denise was waiting, taking his place beside her without hesitation. Some people would say what he did was too much, that there should have been another conversation, another chance. But men like Richard understand something. Others learn too late, that trust isn't rebuilt through words once it's broken through choice, and that the cost of keeping someone in your life who has already shown you who they are is far greater than the cost of letting them go. He didn't say that out loud, he didn't need to, because everything he had done already said it for him.